Okay, let's start as usual with the questions that we have for this week, and then have fun and let me know. If you're watching online, give us about 20-25 minutes and we should be back here. Okay. Okay, come on in, have a seat. John, am I in the right place? Okay. Okay. Today is a fun topic. Hopefully you had fun with the questions. I made them as I told my wife, oh my goodness, I forgot to write questions for today because I had the talk done, but totally forgot the questions. And so I was writing them on the way as we drove here. So she was driving and I was typing. So, okay. This sermon was actually, or this talk was created when my nephew, actually my cousin's son, who is an atheist. Now, just to give you a brief background, I come from a family that dates its Christian heritage back to 51 AD, so almost 2,000 years. We date our heritage back to St. Thomas when he came to India. So we've had Christians in the family line for years, and we're a part of the Mar Thoma Church, which is the Church of St. Thomas. And my dad, a few years ago, my dad said, there's always been a lay preacher in our family. And I said, how come you never told me that before? And he says, because I didn't want to put any pressure on you. So, Thomas the disciple, the apostle of Jesus, went to India and died in India, actually. So, however, my father's generation was full of Marxists and atheists. In fact, I come from a very strong Marxist family. When we would go home for vacation, the argument at the dinner table was which flavor of Marxism was the best one. Should we join the Communist Party of India or the Communist Party Marxist of India, right? And this is the argument. Three of my uncles were famous Marxists. One had a price on his head and actually had to escape. He got married and had to run and hide in the hills and didn't see my aunt for almost 6 months because there was a price on his head. Because Nehru, who was the prime minister at the time, was a socialist, and most socialists and Marxists don't like the other flavor of it. So anyway, so this nephew comes from a line of atheists. His father is an atheist, my cousin, and his grandfather was one of the famous atheist Marxists of that generation. So he sent me this question. He said, he sent me a number of he sent me a cut and paste from the internet of complaints against slavery, and I called them atheist kitty complaints. And the reason I call them that is because it's obvious when I get those that whoever sent them to me had done no research. They just copy and paste, right? As though this is the reality. So, but my nephew, I asked him, I said, have you done any research on this? He says, no, but these are real questions. In other words, if you answer them, because most of the atheist kitty complaints, if you answer them, they go away and they never come back and they never interact with you. They don't care. It's just like, let me post this, see what the dumb Christian says, and then I'll run away, right? But my nephew actually wanted answers, and so I said, okay, well, let me get you some responses. So it turns out there are a lot of responses from Christians on the internet, but most of them were long and confusing, and they never really summarized an easy way to understand what the real answer was. And I'm going to summarize the answer for you in 30 seconds, and then I'll go through and I'll prove what it really is, right? So, but I'm also going to cover what many of the Christians have suggested and show you why they're actually wrong and bad arguments, because I think that's very important. So when my nephew first brought it up, and this is the 30-second answer, I said the Bible uses the word slave, but if you translate it correctly, it should be indentured laborer. That's the answer. Right there, that's the answer. Okay? Now I'll explain that to you. Now, he said, that's not easy. That's not an easy answer. It's not going to be that easy because that's not valid, because if you look at the actual word, it's translated as slavery, and there's no easy way to reconcile that as indentured laborer. So let's look at these questions and see if we can answer them. But let's start with some of the claims. Here is Miro Sorvino, who says, why does it not say anywhere in the Bible that slavery is wrong? It only says that you should treat your slaves well. Well, I don't care if you treat them well. How is it possible that it's not immoral to own another person? Why isn't that one of the 10 commandments? Thou shalt not own another person. You want to sit here and tell me that fornication is worse than owning someone, right? And then, of course, this is another meme that we see. God says it's okay to buy slaves. You may purchase male and female slaves from amongst the nations around you. Leviticus 25:44. And then they say 90% of so-called religious people don't read the Bible. Now, he's correct. I don't know if it's 90%, but a lot of people don't read the Bible, and they should. Now, and worse, they say the children of the slaves can be bought and sold. Leviticus 25:44 says, you may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as permanent inheritance. You may treat your slaves like this, but the people of Israel, your relatives, must never be treated this way. Right? And this is how you're supposed to treat Hebrew slaves. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he's to serve only 6 years. Set him free in the 7th year, and he will owe you nothing for his freedom. If he was single when he became your slave and then married afterwards, only he will go free in the 7th year. But if he was married before he became a slave, then his wife will be freed with him. You're like, wow, how are you going to answer all those? Those are pretty strong statements. Now, and this continues, that last passage, if his master gave him, in other words, why would his wife not go with him? It says, if his master gave him a wife while he was a slave and they had sons or daughters, the man will be free in the 7th year, but his wife and children will still belong to his master. But the slave may plainly declare, I love my master, my wife, my children, I would rather not go free. If he does this, his master must present him before God. Then his master must take him to the door and publicly pierce his ear with an awl. After that, the slave will belong to his master forever. Notice how they can get a male Hebrew slave to become a permanent slave by keeping his wife and children hostage until he says he wants to become a permanent slave. And the question is, what kind of family values is this? The following passage describes the sickening practice of sex slavery. How can anyone think it's moral to sell your own daughter as a sex slave? God condones slavery. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master or selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. And if the slave girl's owner arranges for her to marry his son, he may no longer treat her as a slave girl, but he must treat her as his daughter. If he himself marries her and then takes another wife, he may not reduce food or clothing or fail to sleep with her as a wife. If he fails in any of these 3 ways, she may leave as a free woman without making any payment. There's some clues in here already that you're seeing. What does the Bible say about beating slaves? From a Muslim site that says, strange enough, this site says that Islam condemns slavery. Right? Which is very interesting because Muhammad had slaves, right? Now it says, the Christians are evil because it says you can beat both male and female slaves with a rod so hard that as long as they don't die right away, you're cleared of any wrongdoing. And that's a pretty interesting accusation. So the Holy Book condones killing a slave. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or 2, since the slave is his property. And some of you are thinking, Neil, you should stop digging the hole because it's getting deeper and deeper. How are you going to get out of this? Now, you would think that Jesus in the New Testament would have a different view of slavery, but slavery is still approved in the New Testament according to them, as these following passages show. God condones slavery, said the atheists. This is from the nonsense from the Bible meme. There's a bunch of those. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything and do it. Not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. And that's not the only one. Peter 2:18 says, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, and not only to the good and gentle, but also to the cruel. Like, wow. How are we going to get out of this one? And that's the beauty about the Bible, is the answers are there. You just have to take some time and look at it, because you have to look at when it was written and how it was written. And a lot of you are thinking, oh, well, Neil's going to say it was okay for slavery back then. The culture was different. No. But first of all, let's address the atheist problem. Most of you know this. I'll go through this quickly because I've done this before. The atheist has no foundation to make the claim that slavery is bad. On what basis is the atheist making the claim that atheism is bad? You know, if an atheist says any of the above, you are to first ask him, why do you think slavery is wrong? At which point he'll say, well, isn't it obvious? You say, no, it isn't. You see, for thousands of years, from the foundation of civilization till the 1800s, every single society in the world thought that slavery was wrong as long as they weren't the slaves, except for one group. Every group, every society, every culture, every religion, except for one group, thinks that slavery is okay for others until Christians and Jews said it wasn't okay. So you ask the atheist, what is your basis for saying slavery is evil? What basis did you decide that slavery is evil? Is it only because the laws changed that you think slavery is evil? And why did the laws change? And no, the golden rule doesn't work. Let me explain the golden rule if you haven't done that before. The golden rule is a reciprocal law. In other words, I won't do bad evil to you because someday you may do evil to me. But if I'm a Nazi and I don't see where the Jews will ever take control, ever take power over the Nazis, why would I want to give the Jews any power? Because remember, the golden rule without a God, without a judge, is just only based on protecting yourself from others, right? So if the others can never get back to you, if a slave owner never thinks the slave can ever attack him and take him over and make him a slave, why does the slave owner care? They'll never get me as a slave. The reason the golden rule works is that you see somebody, stuck on the side of the road, and you say, I need to reach out to them because one day I might be stuck on the side of the road. Right? Now you go, well, a lot of people may never get stuck on the side of the road, but then they still help other people. Why? Because now it has been baked into our psyche, it's baked into our culture. It's what we call borrowing moral capital. I don't have time to go into it, but borrowing moral capital basically says that because it's become the norm, I had a discussion with, I'll get to that later. I'll talk about it in a bit. But you guys have seen this. Remember this when we did Evil in God? Let's go over it really quickly. And this, I've kind of modified it for atheism, for slavery. An atheist says God does not exist, right? But then they claim slavery is wrong, right? But if they claim slavery is wrong, what are they claiming? That they know the difference between right and wrong, right? So if they know the difference between right and wrong, what do you need to know? You've heard this before. What's your standard, right? So if there's a standard, then you're asking. If there is no standard, what you're saying is that these are merely preferences. So there is no objective right and wrong. So the atheist can say, well, I just prefer there be no slaves. Well, where did you come up with that idea? Because your atheism didn't come up with that idea. In fact, the idea didn't come from atheism. It came from the Bible, right? But if you say that there is a standard, then what do you need? A standard giver. So if you've got a standard, you've got to have a standard giver. Now the question comes up, and hopefully most of you remember this. If you have a standard giver, then that standard giver has to be what? What kind of person, standard giver? Why would you obey a standard unless the standard giver has what? Authority. Right? And it has to be moral authority. It can't be forceful. It can't be, I'm going to kill you otherwise, right? It has to be a moral authority. Okay, so can the standard giver be man? Can a king take power and say, I'm the standard giver? Is that moral authority? No, that's forced authority, right? That's oppressive authority. He doesn't have that moral authority. So why would a forced authority who is being immoral give you a standard for morality? He can't, okay? So the standard giver can't be man, and if somebody says the standard giver is man, then you ask, is it Mother Teresa or her Hitler? And then, of course, immediately they'll say, well, it's not her Hitler. So then you say, well, okay, is it society? And then the atheist will say, yeah, maybe it's society. And go, wait. You just made a 180-degree turn because remember, we already said that until the 1800s, there was no society that thought slavery was wrong. So it's definitely not society. So is it Mother Teresa? And I always then ask this question. If there is no objective morality, why was Hitler wrong? If there is an objective moral, why do you or Mother Teresa get to decide what it is and not Hitler? Right? And the answer is neither of them. Neither gets to decide what it is. We need an authority who is over all mankind to decide the standard. We need a moral authority. And then the question is, who is the moral authority? Well, it's definitely not Mother Teresa. So who is it? Well, mankind can't set the authority, because who has the authority to tell every single human being that they should treat every other human being equally? If it's not the masses, it's not society, it's not the forcible leaders who use oppression to get you immorally, then who is it? It can only be the person. Who's the only person they have moral authority over every single human being and can tell the Jew he has to treat the Nazi equally, and the Nazi has to treat the Jew equally, and tell the slave he has to treat the master equally, and the master they has to treat the slave equally? As who? The creator of what? All mankind. Logically, and what's so funny is I do this. I talk to people like that. I talked to one of our city councilmen and a guy running for office, and I walked him through that. I said, look, I just got to your unalienable rights have to come from the creator of all mankind. I didn't use the Bible. I didn't mention God until the end, right? I just used logic and reasoning. And he looked at me, he's like, I've never heard that before. And that is a problem that our churches are not teaching this. You've got to teach a logical conclusion. I don't want to use, but there's someone in this room who had a class, and in that class, a person was having doubts. And one of the teachers said, you just need to have faith. And I said, next time that question comes up, ask, well, what about the Hindu or the Muslim? They have faith. Is that enough for them? And then the minute they say, no, it's different. Well, what is it different about it? Oh, we have evidence. Okay, so it's not enough to have faith. You've got to have the evidence on which to base your faith on, right? So in the same way, you've got to have the logic on which to base your faith on. And if God is the giver of logic and the author of logic, or the origin of, I shouldn't even say the author, he's the origin of author because it comes out of him, then it has to be logical. And so therefore, we come to the standard giver as God. Now, and you know that this is going now because you've probably seen this in the evil talk. So if the standard giver is God, but the atheist just said God does not exist. If God does not exist, right, then there is no God. If there is no God, there's no standard giver, there's no standard, there is no difference between right and wrong. If there's no difference between right and wrong, then slavery is not wrong. And what then is your complaint? So, Mr. Atheist, you got to be consistent. Right? Now, note when it comes to slavery, one cannot argue that Buddhists were the first to suggest that all mankind were equal. Because I've talked to people and they say, well, the Buddhists came up with the idea. I'm like, what authority did they come up with? Because Buddhism is basically atheism. There is no God in Buddhism. Right? And if you come up with any pantheistic, oh, well, the force says so. Well, the force is not a moral authority. You can only be morally accountable to a being. Right? You can't be accountable to a mistake or an accident, right? And if you remember, we did that a few weeks ago. We did the Scrabble experiment. If you're playing Scrabble and you throw out the Scrabble pieces and it says, take out the garbage. Do you have to take out the garbage? Even though it's a 1 in a billion chance that it would say take out the garbage, are you morally obliged to take out the garbage? But if your mom says take out the garbage, are you morally obliged? Yes! Why? Because your mom's a person with authority. Moral authority over you. Okay, now, what if your younger brother tells you? Then the answer is no. You're a person, no moral authority, go away, you do it. Right? So here's what I say. Christians are boring moral capital. Why am I saying Christians are boring moral capital? I mean, not Christians. Atheists are boring moral capital. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. Here's why. I was once arguing with someone, and he said that, you know what? We don't need your stupid Bible to tell me not to kill someone or rape someone. I think I've mentioned this before, right? And I said, yeah, maybe you don't need it to kill someone or rape someone because that's very obvious that it's wrong, and society will not function with that. But you do need the Bible to tell you that you should not abuse children. You do need the Bible to tell you should not have slaves. You do need the Bible to tell you should not have racism. You do. And he said, no, I don't. I said, yes, you do. I said, you also need the Bible to tell you shouldn't superstitiously kill twins. You need the Bible to tell you that you shouldn't abandon adults in the older people in the wild. You need the Bible to tell you shouldn't sacrifice babies to Moloch. He goes, no, I don't. I said, yes, you do. In fact, you need a Bible for all these things. These are some of the thousands of practices Christians have made illegal. Slavery, racism, segregation, kidnapped brides, child labor, gladiatorial combat, death games, infanticide, child marriage, temple prostitution, child sexual abuse, child prostitution, wives of property, cruel treatment of prisoners, and inequality of mankind. I said, every single one of these were brought about because Christians got involved in politics and changed the laws. This is moral capital that you're borrowing from. You have been brought up in this, and you think that this is your conscience speaking, but it's not. Your conscience is referring back and borrowing Christian moral capital. And if you've heard me speak in church during election season, I talk to pastors and they say, I don't think we should be involved in politics. I said, that means you believe all these should be true, should be legal. And they said, no, we don't. I said, yes, you do, because every single one of these were changed because a pastor or a Christian or a church got involved in politics and changed the laws. In fact, if you say Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, then you are saying that slavery should still be legal. Why? Because a certain group of Christians got together and in a church, and they started a new political party to stop slavery. How heartless, cruel, and wicked can you be to say Christians should not be involved in politics? Now, and these are just a few. There are thousands of laws. I've just not even touched the surface. You know, I don't want this to necessarily be a promo for my book, but in my book, I list a bunch more, right? And I give you links to all of them. And that the book is Jesus is Involved in Politics. Okay, however, having said that, though, thank you, there's a promotion right there. Having said that, though, the Bible does need to be self-consistent, right? Yeah, so the atheist has no case, but the Christians have got to be able to defend if they think slavery is bad, and the Bible says slavery is bad, and lots of Christians fought to stop slavery. Where did that idea come from? Is it just a preference? So I'm going to cover a few of the, what I call the not so great responses to why the Bible doesn't talk about slavery. The first one is Jesus and Paul did not want to revolutionize the world. Okay. This is simply wrong. If you look at the Bible came precisely to revolutionize the world. In fact, I can't think of a more revolutionary book. You can draw a line in the sand of pre-Christian and post-Christian, and you can look that everything changed. Everything changed. You look at the gladiatorial combat. You look at all the horrible things they used to do before, and now you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. And before it was like, yeah, I guess that's it. Life means nothing. I mean, the Bible equalized men and women, slave and free, Gentile and Jew, Africans and Europeans, peasants and kings. I mean, I know you're thinking it wasn't written to politically revolutionize the world, but even that is wrong, because it's a book that says all kings and peasants are equal. All servants and masters have rights. It introduced the idea of rights and liberties, and even introduced the republican form of government back in Exodus. Right? Now, you might be thinking, well, Jesus didn't plan on starting a slave revolution. Well, maybe, maybe not. But he was looking at a long-term plan, and you don't get to that long-term plan by saying slavery was okay or ignoring it. So the first one is just completely wrong. Let's look at the second one. God gives progressive moral revelation, and I've had this one. And the idea is that, you know, God gives you a few laws, and then you get a few more, and you get a few more, and you get a few more. Now, I do believe that we discover moral laws that God hasn't given us over time. But the idea that God gives us progressive moral revelation when he could have just told us right from the beginning slavery is wrong would be silly, because this is actually quite silly, because remember, how many laws did he give the Israelites on Mount Sinai? 10. And then shortly after, he gives them another 603. Okay, you don't think one of them could have been no slavery? Right? So that's silly. Okay, so let's look at the last one. The next one. The New Testament God is kinder and gentler than the Old Testament God. And the idea was God was harsh and strict in the Old Testament, but sweet and loving in the New. God was a tyrant in the Old Testament, but a father in the New Testament. Right? Now, I've heard this. In fact, I heard this so often that I actually started buying it until I said, something's wrong, because God is immutable, meaning he doesn't change. So then why is he changing? So I started looking for this, and I asked myself, and I'll ask you this. When is the first time it says in the Bible you should love your neighbor as yourself? Anyone? Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. In fact, if you look at the 10 commandments, what are the first 4 commandments? Love the Lord your God. What are the other 6? Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't kill, don't steal. Don't lust, it's all, don't lie, right? It's all love your neighbor. That's why when Jesus, remember, who says the two commandments are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself? Does Jesus say that? No, it's the rich young ruler. How does he know it? Because it's baked into his teachings from the Torah. He didn't have the New Testament. So, how about things like the ceremonial laws? Let me explain the ceremonial laws. The ceremonial laws were things like you should wash your hands. When you go into the temple, you should do certain things. You shouldn't mix old wine with new wineskins, and you shouldn't mix old cloth with new cloth, and you should farm the fields in certain ways, right? Well, let me explain why the ceremonial laws were given. Many of the ceremonial laws, like not eating shellfish and stuff, are actually healthy. Turns out that if the Jews, if you look back at the Jews in the first century, they used to live till they were 90. Everybody else was dying at the age of 40. Right? Maybe their dietary laws were working, right? So, but if you think of the ceremonial laws were given to the Jews to preserve them as a race. Think about this. God had a whole bunch of prophecies in the Old Testament. If the Jews are intermarrying and they're mixing around and not keeping their ceremonies and not keeping their land and moving around their land, how will any one of these prophecies that Jesus will be born from the line of David in the tribe of Judah, in the house of David, in the city of David, if they're all over the world? The only way this prophecy can come true, which will prove that the Messiah was Jesus, is if there is a way for that prophecy to be fulfilled and preserved. And so God preserves his people. And in the same way, he says, look, we've got to keep these ceremonial laws. We've got to keep the Jews separate from the non-Jews, the foreigners separate from the locals, unless they become Jewish in belief. And they were always welcome to do that, like Ruth, right? And Rahab, and all these people. Okay. Secondly, Jesus said that he came to I did not come to abolish the law, but to what? Fulfill it. So once he fulfills the law, is there any need for the law? So why don't we do the ceremonial laws today? Because the purpose of the ceremonial law was for Jesus to prove himself as Messiah. And after that, the ceremonial law is not needed anymore. And if you look in the book, in the book Jesus is Involved in Politics, I go through the 4 kinds of laws. The 4 kinds of laws are ceremonial laws, moral laws, and these are the ones we have to keep, judicial laws, and these are the punishments, and civil laws, and this is how high a door should be or how big the balcony should be. Of all of those, we have our own judicial laws, what the punishment should be. We have our own civil laws. We don't need to keep the ceremonial laws, so the only one we have to keep is the moral law. Now, I would recommend that we keep the civil laws and ceremonial laws, too, if we can, and we see them appropriate, but we don't have to, right? Okay, so that is why the God of the Old Testament is not mean and loving, and that's why the God of the Old Testament should say that slavery is wrong in the Old Testament, shouldn't he? We can't say, well, God didn't care about slaves in the Old Testament, and suddenly he does in the New. Okay. The third one is the curse of Ham. And this is the silliest one. I've heard so many people say this. The curse of Ham nonsense is based on the theory that Ham, the son of Noah, in Genesis 9:20, was cursed by Noah. And since Ham is the father of Cush and Ethiopia, the black people, they are destined to be slaves. Well, let me blow this apart right away. First of all, Noah did not curse Ham. He cursed Ham's son, which was Canaan. Okay? Ham was the father of 4 sons. Mizr, which is Egypt, is what they call themselves. Cush, which is Sudan and Ethiopia, which are the black nations. And Put, which is Libya, and Canaan, which are more of the Arabs. Right? They gave rise to 30 nations. Only one of them were so if you follow, so this is Ham right here, right? This is Egypt. And from Egypt, you got the Philistines, right? And Canaan, you got the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinaites, Arvadites, Zemarites, Hammonites, and the Perizzites, right? And from Cush, you get the Ethiopians, right? Now, so this is obviously the problem, because guess who was cursed? this line was cursed. Now look at that line. Do any of these people exist? No, they've been wiped out completely. Cush exists. Egypt exists. Put exists, right? Although we don't know what his kids were because there's no line there, right? All these other guys. Now, why do we call them Semites? Because they're the sons of Shem. Right? Now, this isn't something the Bible said. It was some guy in the 1700s who decided to call the Shemites, right? But from there we get the Arabs, right? We get the Arabs, and the Arabs were the what? The kids of the children of Ishmael, right? Okay, so none of this curse of Ham works because black people aren't from the line of Canaan. This doesn't work. Okay, thirdly, and this is the one I've seen a lot. We'll do bad things anyway, so God wants to regulate it. Well, you're going to have slaves anyway, so God is not going to condemn it in the Old Testament. He's just going to give you ways to manage it. Now, this does have some validity, right? Because in the Bible, Jesus says, God hates divorce, but because of the hardness of your heart, he allowed it, right? But this is not the same as God hates murder, but because of the hardness of your heart, he's going to allow it. Right? Completely different. And so it's also different from God hates slavery, but because of the hardness of your heart, he's going to let you enslave people. Right? Doesn't work. Right? So that just doesn't follow. So let's understand the real reasons why slavery seems to be regulated in the Bible. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what did the original author mean in Hebrew? And then what did the translator of the Bible mean when he used those English words? Let me give you an example. When you translate something in the Bible, you have to understand what the translated word meant when it was translated and what it meant to the person who wrote it. And a great example is unicorns. The Bible talks about unicorns. But we've never seen a unicorn. We have no fossil evidence for unicorns. It's a mythical creature that only appears in Disney movies. Or does it? And here's a great video that talks about that.
In the books of Numbers,
which is fantastic.
If we're going to use the Bible for science, we've got some tough things to explain. What are you going to do about unicorns? We're mentioned 8 times in the Bible. I want to tell you what, we have never found a fossil of a unicorn.
By the way, where are the unicorns that are referred to in the Bible? Where are those? Either in the fossil record or today. See one of those. Another one of those interesting tests that failed.
well, if you know 1828 in our Webster's Dictionary, which is the very first edition dictionary that Webster came out with about 200 years ago, and if you look at the word unicorn, it says that unicorn is an animal with one horn, the monoceros. This name is often applied to the rhinoceros. Notice how this definition says absolutely nothing about a horse. It says nothing about a horse-like animal or a mythical animal or a fictitious creature. It says absolutely nothing about Greek mythology whatsoever, but rather it says that this is the name that is often applied to the rhinoceros. Wait a minute. What? The rhinoceros? You mean this is a unicorn? The rhinoceros has 2 horns. How could this be a unicorn? Well, if you look up the word rhinoceros in the same dictionary, it says that rhinoceros is a genus of quadrupeds of 2 species, one of which, the unicorn, has a single horn growing almost erect from the nose. This animal, when full grown, is said to be 12 feet in length. There's another species with 2 horns, the bicornis. They are natives of Asia and of Africa. According to Noah Webster, back in the early 1800s, it was understood that there were 2 species of the rhinoceros. The one-horned species was called unicorn, and then the 2-horned species was called bicornis. So basically, you get a 200-year-old Noah Webster dictionary, and look at the word unicorn, it says rhinoceros, and look at the word rhinoceros, and it says unicorn. That was 200 years ago. The old King James was translated 400 years ago, in 1611. So if the definition of the word unicorn has changed in just the past 200 years from rhinoceros to horse, then it doesn't make much sense to take a modern definition of the word unicorn and apply it to a 400-year-old translation of the Bible. That's illogical.
The question is, quite simply, what did the translator intend it to mean, and what did the original Hebrew mean when it uses the word slave? So first of all, you can see that, well, one thing is that the modern day translations really need to come up to speed, right? They're using a word, they're being lazy. They should go back to the original intent of that word and realize that he's talking about the word in the Hebrew really is talking about a rhinoceros, right? So what are the words that are slave in the Old Testament that are translated as today? Well, first of all, the Bible does not use English. It uses the word Hebrew called ebed or eved. If you ever are confused in Hebrew, the letter B, when it comes after, not the initial letter, but if it's a second letter or a third letter in the name or in the word, it is actually a V. So Rebecca is not Rebecca, it's Rebecca, right? Abraham is not Abraham, it's Avraham. Reuben is actually Reuben, right? Benjamin is Benjamin, right? But if any time that letter B shows up in our English, it really is a V. In fact, if you look at the translation in Malayalam, which is my native language, it always keeps the V. So in India, you will find somebody named Avrachan, which is Abraham. Right? Now, they'll translate to English, and you'll find a lot of Abrahams. But if you go back to the original Malayalam, it's Avraham. Okay, so the word is aved, right? And if you start translating it, here are the words in English. That's the little lights at the top kind of make it hard to read there. But note that the Hebrew, by the way, what's very interesting is Hebrew has a limited vocabulary. In fact, the entire lexicon of Hebrew is only 6,000 words, right? And that is 1% of the English vocabulary, which is at least 660, if not a million, 660,000, if not a million words. So not only is the grammatical context king, but cultural context is also king. You don't know what the writer means unless you look at the grammatical context, the literary context, and the cultural context, right? So here we have the word up there, which is shipla, means handmaid, maidservant, bondwoman, maiden, women servants, right? Servant, and in English, Old English, wench, right? And then ama is handmaid, maidservant, maid, bond. So you see, you keep seeing that word, bondwoman and maidservant, bondmaids, right? So you're not seeing any slaves here, right? And you come down here, finally you get the word aved or abed. You get servant, manservant, bondman, bondage, bondservant, slave. And then down you come here, sakir or shkur. You have hired servant, hireling, hired man. And then nar is young man, servant. Again, there's the word servant there. And sharat is minister, serve, servant, service, servitor, awaited. So this word is the same word as prime minister. It's the same word that you sometimes see translated as servant, which be minister. It's also what you do when you're in ministry. You're a servant to the Lord, right? So all these words are there. Okay, now here's another word that's important, and that is possession. The word achua is possession, and another word ovlam, because remember there was a you will be his slave forever. If you look at this, it could be ever, everlasting, old, perpetual, evermore, never, ancient, world, always, always, long duration. You've got to start looking at the context. And then kana is to get, to acquire, create, buy, possess. Same word for acquiring a wife. You kana a wife, you can kana a bondsman. Are you buying it? Are you possessing it? No, you're getting it, right? So a lot of words there. To get, to acquire, to obtain. Of God originating, redeeming his people. Kana does, right? Possessor, acquiring. So you have to look at all these different words and you have to put it in the right context. Now, so what does the Bible mean when it uses the word slave? And what do the translators mean to imply when they use the word slave? And is it the right word to use today in today's English? So to start, we have to be clear with our terminology. Here's what I mean when I use this word. Servant. This is an individual who works for a living for a household voluntarily. This person has full rights and can quit and get another job anytime. In some sense, any employee is a servant of the one who pays him. Today, if you run a huge farm, all the folks working a farm would be employees. 3,000 years ago, they would be identified as your servants. So when it said Abraham had many servants, they were really his employees. And the real English translation really needs to catch up to what we mean today, because today, back in the 1611 time frame when they translated things, they would understand what that meant. Today we don't. And we get these foolish atheists coming up with these crazy schemes, right? Okay, now here's what's interesting about servants. Servants as employees are actually very powerful positions. For example, one of the first slaves, actually servants, we meet in the Bible is Eliezer, Abraham's servant, who, guess what? If Eliezer had not been able to find a wife for Isaac, see how much Abraham trusts this man. If he had not been able to find a wife for Isaac, Eliezer would have inherited all of Abraham's belongings after Abraham died. And Abraham sends him to find the wife because he trusts him that much. Okay, so the next word we have to define is bondsman. A bondsman was what we would today call an indentured worker, somebody who works to pay off a debt. The Hebrew laws on indentured laborers or bondsmen were set up for multiple reasons. Okay? In this case, he was allowed to do two things. The Hebrew society was designed to allow capitalism, right? But where do you get your capital from? It was to allow investment in business and to cover inevitable failure of business. If you failed in business, you had to pay back what you owe. Today, we have bankruptcy laws in America. And these laws are not perfect because they hurt people. Because often business people have no skin in the game. They can hold multiple companies, declare multiple bankruptcies, and not owe anyone money. Yet they hurt the folks who supplied them goods. For instance, let's say you build a small hotel, and you put down $10 million and you borrow $70 million. Right? But you also have vendors, from the small contractor who works for $35 an hour to the large restaurant who feeds your laborers and to the large lumber mill that provides you with wood. Now, let's say you want to get that on credit. Today, you use a credit card. And you can stiff the credit company, but then you'll ruin your credit, right? But in those days, you couldn't. And again, it's not a good idea to do that because it creates a lot of other problems. But let's say you start a company and you mess up. And you decide to declare bankruptcy. Today, you can avoid paying any of them. You don't have to pay the $70 million. You don't pay back the restaurant. You don't pay back the contractor. The lumber mill could go out of business. They would have to lay off people. The restaurant will end up not having to pay off their workers. And the investors of the bank will lose their money for the people who invested the money. So in ancient Israel, they had a different solution, right? The laws for bankruptcy were not perfect, but it worked in a faulty world, right? Now remember, in a broken world, nothing's going to work perfectly. So there's always give and take and things you have to compromise. So let's say you borrowed $55 million on a bonded promissory note, right? Or you went to a lumber mill and you said, I'm going to borrow money to buy this lumber. I'm going to buy this lumber on credit. You would get a promissory note for the amount of lumber you owed. Now, if you went bankrupt and the thing failed, guess what? You still had to pay back the lumber mill. You still had to pay back the $55 million. How would you pay it back? Well, the only way you could pay it back was you had to work for them. Now, if you were a decent businessman who just made one mistake, somebody else might say, hey, I want that guy working for me. I'm going to hire him. And every time he gets paid, I'm going to pay you. What do we call this here? When you have to pay somebody your wages. We call it garnishing your wages. So anything you work, the bondholder would get paid. So I'll buy that note for you. Somebody will come and say, hey, I know Neil's a hard worker, and I know he messed up on this company, but I'm going to buy that note from you so he will come work for me. So yeah, he owes you $55 million. I think he can make $30 million working for me. I will buy that note from you for $30 million. You're going to lose some money, but now at least you'll get the money right now, not later. And I now have to make sure that, the guy who buys my labor now has to make sure that for the rest of my life, I'm going to work for him until I pay it off. Now, as soon as I pay him off, I'm free, okay? Now, that person could also sell my note, right? He could say, I got a debt, I'm going to sell it to you. And that happens today all the time in financial circles. And if I sold the note, I would follow the note. I would have to work for it. Now, would I work for him directly? No, I could work anywhere I wanted, but normally I would work for his household because he wanted to make sure I was working for him. And the money was going because they didn't have the bank system easily, right? The bank that we do now. So if you were an Israelite, however, things were different. If you're an Israelite, every 7 years, your note would be canceled. You see that? So if you borrowed $55 million on year 1, in 7 years, that note would be canceled. So guess what? Nobody would loan you $55 million if they didn't think you could produce $55 million worth of labor in 7 years. Because at the end of 7 years, guess what? No payment. And if there was a year of Jubilee, every 50 years there was a year of Jubilee, and as you got closer to the year of Jubilee, and the year of Jubilee, any notes were canceled, guess what? Everybody said, I'm not going to lend you $55 million because the year of Jubilee is next year. I know what's going to happen. I'll lend you $50. Right? And so they would do that in their transaction. Right? And then you would go to the lumber mill, he goes, no, next year's the year of Jubilee. You're paying cash this year. Sorry, buddy. Right? Okay. So remember we said what a slave is. A slave, the third definition is a slave. So that was bondsman, right? So the third definition is a slave. A slave is an individual forcibly kidnapped and forcibly made to serve others with no payment or return. The individual has no rights, can be killed at will, and can be sold and kept as property. This is the kind of slavery we saw in ancient Rome and in the United States. Okay? Slavery was this sort of slavery was completely forbidden under Mosaic law, and I will prove that to you shortly. The Bible condemns this with a punishment of what? Death. If you did this sort of slavery, you would be executed on the spot. So we have to look at the context and ask, what sense is the Bible using the word abed or aved in any given passage? Is it meant to be slavery? And here's what's very interesting. In the 1611 version of the King James Bible, right, the word slave is only used twice in the Bible. And here are the 2 times. Jeremiah 2:14, is Israel a servant? He's a homeborn slave. Why is he spoiled? In Revelation 18:13, and cinnamon and odors and ointments and frankincense and wine and oil and fine flour and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. And this is talking about a future slavery by probably the Antichrist or something like that. These are the only 2 passages in the King James that is translated as slave. Do you know what every other passage translates as? Bondservant. Now, in the Geneva Bible, it throws up one at a time. It throws those 2 times plus 1, and this, it says, and Joseph was sold for a slave. Again, very accurate descriptions of what is happening. And none of them are the passages that the atheists are quoting. Every time, Ebed is translated as bondsman or bondservant. So how do the King James Version, most translators, translate the passages in question back then? Go back to Leviticus 25:44. Both thy bondmen and thy bondsmaids which thou shalt have shall be of the heathen. They are round about you, and of them shall ye buy bondsmen and bondsmaid. So is this slavery? No, you're buying somebody's debt. And you're saying, I'm going to buy your debt and you're going to work for me. They have a contract with you, and I'm going to fill it out. Now, it wasn't until the 1900s that for some reason the translators chose to change the translation of bondsmen as slaves. And as we saw, that's when the NLT and NASB quotes are used by the atheists. But it's incorrect. It has no basis in fact. Okay? So I'm going to do one of these passages, and then we'll wrap up because we're at 8:40. And we'll wrap up next week, which is the last week of the class, by the way. So were there real slaves allowed in Israel? And remember, I said I was going to give you proof that the Bible condemns slavery and punishes by death. Exodus 21:16. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he's caught must be what? The idea of slavery was punishable by death in the Bible. And every Hebrew knew that. And more than that, there is no examples of Hebrew slaves ever in the history of Israel. We never see that. Now, there is one exception to the rule, is when they would capture prisoners. And then they were prisoners of war, and they were made to do infrastructure projects. Because the question was, what are you going to do with these prisoners of war? You release them, they're going to come back and attack you. So you kept them and you used them as prisoners of war, but you could not personally use them. Now, of course, kings ended up using them, but the rest of it was supposed to be building roads and building things like that. Okay, I did say I would go through. I'll go through a couple of the verses that they have quoted. So here it is, King James 1. Remember? So we know that the law is good, and if a man uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and mothers, murders of mothers, for manslaughter, for whoremongers. This is the New Testament saying slavery is banned. For them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that's contrary to sound doctrine, the Bible condemns men stealers, which is exactly what we think of when we think of slavery, where a person is taken. So there's no evidence that the Jews ever had slaves. Now, some people come up to me and say, why is it so difficult for us to understand? Why do you have to, I sent this to an atheist, he says, well, if you have to twist and turn to do that, I said, I didn't do any twisting and turning. I showed you the old translation, I showed you the new translating. You just don't know how to read Hebrew. Go read Hebrew. Go read Greek, right? I mean, how ethnocentrically racist can you be? To insist that your English translation is the only correct translation. When did you become an expert in Hebrew? Right? Now, I thought I was going to go through it, but that's going to come later on. I'll start going through each of the passages that they use in context. But we'll do that next week. Let's close in prayer. And actually, yeah, what time is it? It's 8:40. You have 3 more minutes. Let's close in prayer, and then if there are any questions, you guys can ask, and then we'll let you go if you need to go. Dear Lord, thank you so much that your word is true and logical and rational. And we pray that people will realize this and that you will be able to talk about this to others. Because this is a topic that comes up so often, Lord. And actually is the root of why we have so many people abandoning the Bible in many cases, especially amongst the atheists, Lord. Of course, in most of those cases, they don't want it to be true. But they do influence others, Lord. So we pray that you will use this information, that we will be able to spread it to others. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Thank you. Any questions? But if you need to go, you can, yeah. Mike.
So the people that you mentioned that like to criticize Christianity and say that it condones slavery, do these same people tend to go after other religions like Islam or whatnot?
So some of them do. So there are some, like for instance, Dawkins goes after every religion, right? So does Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer is hardcore. In fact, he was really hardcore against the Muslims. And so, yeah, so they do. But
because we both know the answer.
Yeah. So they do, yeah. But it's, but there are more Christians around, so they go after us more often. So, yeah.
Easier.
Yeah,
prey,
and easier
target.
And interestingly enough, the Christians will respond. You know, a lot of Christians, and it's sad because a lot of Christians don't know the answer, but they will make some statement without doing any research, and then they look foolish, and then the atheists go, "Yeah, I won," kind of thing. Right?
Are there any Jewish or Hebrew apologetics too that are out there, not just Christian?
There may be. They're not as, because if you understand Judaism, there's no. You're not supposed to go out and evangelize.
Really?
There's no evangelism, because the only way you can be Jewish is if your mother was Jewish. But you could become Jewish by accepting.
You could convert.
By converting.
Willingly.
Yeah, but as far as we've seen, the concept of evangelization is no. If you want to become a Jew, it's because you wanted to become one, not because somebody convinced you.
Okay, thank you.
So you don't see as much. I'll just say you don't see as much apologetics in it. But there are apologists. There definitely are Jewish apologists. I mean, a great one is Dennis Prager, right?
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Anybody else?
Any other questions? No. Okay.
Not a question, but I just
Yeah.
want to say this is extremely informative, and
thank you.
I think it's very appropriate given the time and the day that we live in. We definitely need to learn how to defend our faith because you never know when you might run into these questions.
Right.
So it's always good to be armed with the truth.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, yeah, right here.
seem to. Oh, sorry. I'm still stuck on your question 7 because
Which was?
whether the New Testament and the Old
Oh.
Testament have
Yeah.
different feels, and I've always thought that the Old Testament, the common thread, aside from being a history, is that it's focused on the law, and then the common thread in the New Testament is not. I mean, it's moved on beyond the law. So it does seem to, the books themselves seem to have a different feel because of that.
So the problem, though, is if you look at the Old Testament, there are just as many of these personal relationships that God has with individuals. God talks to Moses. He talks to Abraham. He talks to Joshua. There are these personal relationships that he has. So it's just as relational. In fact, more relational because he talks to the prophets and he comforts the prophets. He does all that stuff. Yeah. And if you look at the New Testament, there's also just as much judgment in the New Testament as there is in the Old Testament, because Jesus tells them about the abomination of desolation that's about to come, that hits in 70 AD, right? Jesus says, this is what's going to happen. He says, this generation shall not pass before these things can happen. And, 34 years later, Vespasian comes in, I think Vespasian, right? And he destroys Jerusalem so completely that not even a wall is left standing, right? And then, but what's worse is he blames the Jews themselves because the desolation is so bad, and Josephus tells us all about it. I mean, it was like the Jews were fighting against each other. The Jews that were they decided to attack Rome, right? And the Jews that were behind the walls of Jerusalem, some of them said, no, we want to give up to the Romans because whatever the Romans do with us, it'll be far less than us starving to death here. And they were cannibalistic. They were being cannibals. And Vespasian, again, I always forget his name, but I think it was him. He comes and he says, he realizes that they're being cannibals, and he says, this is upon them. Because it's so horrific. He says, all they have to do is give up. But then what he doesn't realize is, and we realize later, is that some of them were trying to leave, but the Jews on one side were killing the Jews who wanted to leave. Right? And then it gets even worse because, as Josephus says, some Jews were because as they tried to escape, they would swallow their diamonds and their jewelry so they could get through it against, because there were a bunch of bandits outside. And then the bandits realized that, and so they would cut them open to take out the diamonds, and then they started cutting open everybody because they thought everybody had diamonds. And this abomination of desolation Jesus talks about. He says it's coming to the next generation, so flee. Hope that you can flee into the hills. Hope that you're not pregnant. Hope that you're not... if the sign comes while during harvest, run into the hills, right? He talks about this, and that generation sees it all, right? So we see, in fact, in some cases, more horrific things, right, that happen, right? And then, of course, the Revelation, the thing to come. So I understand that it feels, but remember, 4 of the Gospels is about Jesus, and then there's the letters, but in all that, it's the same God, it's the same, it's just not talking about the history of people.
Well, but it's the same God, but would the adulteress have been handled
differently in the Old
Testament?
So the question there is, it's a valid question, and I have to think about that before I answer that. I think there were cases where people were forgiven, but in the Old Testament, they were commanded, because Jesus wasn't there. So the judge, they had to follow the orders of the judgment. In the New Testament, Jesus is now one making that claim. Yeah. Right? But I would say that if Jesus was going to forgive the lady in the New Testament, he would have also forgiven the lady in the Old Testament, because the standards had not changed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, give her the mic. Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you.
Right.
Think of Rahab. That's a great example. I didn't even think about it.
Right. And just the line of Jesus, the woman that were adopted into the line that Jesus came. Yeah. Moses.
Yeah, the murderer, right, yeah. Right. Great question, though. Yep. Absolutely, yeah. But I do think when you start looking at it, we'll start realizing that it's this. The only difference is that Jesus fulfills the prophecy, right? So everything, and he says not one jot or tittle of the law will be passed away, but it will be fulfilled, right? So once he's fulfilled it, then the law is not necessary anymore. But the moral law is always there. That does not change.
Kind of a quick question here.
Yeah.
What Bible do you endorse? What version? Or do you read?
I read all of them because I'll read one version and then next year I'll read another. I keep switching. The one my daughter and I like it's called the Hebrew Names version because I like seeing the actual Hebrew names. This is where you see the Reuben instead of Reuben and all that stuff. So that's one I like. I like a lot of the original Jewish translations because they tend to be more to the original cultural concepts. But I flip around a lot. I would say if you gave me what is your favorite Bible, I'd say it would be the modern English translation of the Geneva Bible. Because that's what our founding fathers used.
Interesting. Okay.
Right.
And I don't know if you know a Bible Hub. Bible Hub, you just,
Yeah.
has all the translations.
So actually, this is a good, I'm glad you brought that up. So I use something called My Sword. There used to be something called eSword. I don't know if it's available anymore, but I don't have, since I hate Apple, I should clarify that. I love Apple hardware. I hate Apple software. So I shouldn't say that even, because I'll rephrase that. I don't like iPhones. How's that? But I do like MacBooks, but I run Windows on it. So, so I don't know if they have. There used to be something called eSword, but the Android version of it is called My Sword. And the great thing about it is you can download almost any translation available. Although I don't think you can have NASB and NIV because those are paid versions. And you can also download commentaries. But the great thing is you can download the King James Version, which has the Strong's commentary and the Strong's dictionary. So you all remember when I showed you all those words? That comes from the Strong's Bible, the Strong's dictionary. So Strong basically says this word is used in all these verses, and this is what it means, and this is how it's translated in each of these verses. It's a great thing to go look at. So My Sword for your Android. The only danger with that is, as my wife complains, is I'll be looking at it and the pastor has gone on and I'm looking at 3 other things that I found interesting that's related to that verse. And my wife would go, stop.
I was just sitting between you guys.
Oh.
I get nuts and it's like, hunt your dad for me.
Any other questions? Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you guys. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. It is our last week. And then we'll finish this off.